Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tensions continue to rise in Sri Lanka as the deepening economic crisis has led to mass protests against President Rajapaksa, with government ministers resigning en masse recently. The resignations were followed by that of the central bank governor, suggesting that the root of the country's economic political strife is economic. Now, with the government struggling to repay debt and national reserves at an all-time low, what choices are there for a country located at the intersection of big power rivalry in the region? Dr. Chulani Athanayake joins us now. She's a research fellow with the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. She's calling in from Sri Lanka. Dr. Chulani, before we move into the analysis of what's happening with the twin crises, maybe you can begin by helping us understand whether the events of recent days have actually suggested to you a de-escalation of tensions, or has it been the opposite? Are tensions ramping up instead?
Sorry, I did not get your question. I'm sorry, we are experiencing heavy rain here. Can you kindly repeat the question?
Sure, of course. I'm wondering whether the events of recent days suggest to you a de-escalation of tensions. Is that the trajectory of the crises that we're seeing in Sri Lanka?
De-escalation, what we experienced for the past few days is still the protests are going on. And it is difficult to say whether there will be a de-escalation of the situation at the moment. There are major calls by the public for the resignation of the government, even with the cabinet resigning en masse, has not subdued the anger of the people.
Dr. Chulani, is the anger directed also at the Rajapaksa family? Is there a kind of personalized dimension to the protests?
I think I should say that the protest started with people feeling frustrated at the existing economic crisis, which is a result of long-term economic mismanagement. But looking at the past few days, even with the cabinet resigning, I think the anger is more directed at the Rajapaksa family because what the protesters request is for the president and the prime minister, who are members of the Rajapaksa family, to step down. So yes, there is slightly personal dimension into it, and from the public protesters' perception, they are the core of the problem. Their economic mismanagement, corruption, nepotism, centralizing of power has contributed to the existing crisis. That's what the protesters are saying. So you see a somewhat personalized direction in the existing situation, yes.
If I could just follow up on that, have the strategies of the government, I understand they try to shut down social media. They've been arresting media workers, journalists covering the protests at the homes of many of these elected officials. Is that having a dampening effect on the protests, or are people defying the attempts of government to repress the anger?
I think people are defying the government for trying to protect, subdue their frustration. I personally believe that it was a bad call on part of the government to go for a social media ban, because obviously it's natural for people to feel frustrated after experiencing months and months of shortage of the essentials of food, fuel, and medicine. People have to wait for hours in long queue, over 10 hours of power cut. Food price has inflated exponentially in last month alone between 25 to 30%. So in a context like that, I think people have to voice their concerns. So how the social media ban is being perceived as like government's attempt to subdue them, government's attempt to shut them out. So I think it had a counter effect, even though government tried to sort of manage the situation in doing that. It was a misplaced strategy.
Well, since you brought up the deepening economic crisis, I'm just wondering, I mean, with all the impact that's happening to the people of Sri Lanka now, what do you think has led up to this point? I mean, how has the Sri Lankan economy been made this vulnerable?
This is not something that happened overnight. We should admit that. There are multiple factors. First, decades and decades of economic mismanagement and misplaced policies of every successive government in the country since independence. Secondly, Sri Lanka also experienced 30 years of war, which had major effect on the economy. And adding to that, even after the war, I think the way that economy was handled was not sustainable. And as a result of all this, Sri Lanka is suffering from a crime deficit problem, where there's a deficit in the balance of payment as well as the foreign exchange. And also, I think with regard to the existing acceleration of the issue, it's partly because of the pandemic and also misplaced policies by the existing government. Soon after the government came into power, there were tax reductions and tax cuts because those were part of their election promises. And then the pandemic hit the world, and some of Sri Lanka's main foreign currency earnings stopped: tourism, remittance from migrants, etc. In Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka's economy is built in a way that we are more import dependent than export. So all this have contributed to the existing economic crisis. But I would say the pandemic and certain delay in making crucial decisions, misplaced policies, have accelerated the situation.
Dr. Chilani, I understand that there's a debate, at least in observers are saying, the choice that Sri Lanka made, or the government of Sri Lanka rather made, not to go to the IMF and rather seek assistance from both India and China, for which they have fairly strong relations with, also suggested a fear of the kind of structural reforms that IMF would impose if the country it chose that direction. What's your take on this debate between going to the IMF or going to China and India as a way of dealing with the balance of payment crisis?
Well, Sri Lankan governments have always been a little reluctant to go to IMF over the years, especially Sri Lanka Production Peramuna and Sri Lanka Freedom Party. They are center-left parties, and they have always had a very nationalistic approach into economic policies and economic management. So usually during the election, they always promise that they will not go for these kind of reforms, and they worry that because such reforms would entail downsizing of the public service, privatization, restructuring of state-owned enterprises, etc. So it is sort of true to say that the reluctance or refusal to go to IMF was partly because of the structural reforms and also because of the way that they handled their election campaign.
Right, but then in choosing to have gone to India and China, who are regional rivals, what are the implications of receiving the $4.5 billion in emergency aid from both China and India?
These are very like short-term relief to the public. Credit lines and loans from India has provided has pumped some foreign exchange to the country's economy, but that has not been able to address the core issue. Currency swaps have been able to pump some forex into the country, and even credit lines have provided essential food, medicine, and basic commodities. But it is not enough to mitigate the situation. That's why Sri Lanka should go to more long-term sustainable economic policy reform.
Dr. Chilani, I understand your expertise is in Sri Lanka's relationship with China. A lot of talk, often Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port is brought up as an example of debt diplomacy. What do you make of the role of China in Sri Lanka's economy for the long term? Is it as bad, is China exploiting Sri Lanka, or is there some sort of synergies between Sri Lanka and China that can help the long-term recovery of the economy?
I think China is a partner that you have to deal with closely in the current context, because it is the fastest growing economy and the second largest economy in the world. So Sri Lanka obviously benefits from China's growth. In my opinion, most of the criticism on China's involvement in Sri Lanka has a geopolitical angle into it. I cannot say that Sri Lanka has not benefited from its relationship, trade and investment relationships with China. For instance, if you take the Western Terminal, the CICT Southern Terminal in the Colombo port, Chinese investment there made the Colombo port the fastest growing port in the region. So because of that, I cannot totally agree with the fact of all this debt trap discourse. If you look at the Sri Lanka's debt component, China's debt is only about 10%. Our major debt is for the international institutions in the form of sovereign bonds. But because of Hambantota strategic location, I think because of Sri Lanka's strategic location, we garner a lot of attention whenever China is involved. But in my opinion, there are more facts into it. I know that Sri Lankan scholars are trying to sort of provide these facts to the international community, but they are always being debated and taken with a lot of criticism.
Right. Dr. Chilani, I just want to ask you, you mentioned that long-term economic reform is needed to address some of the economic woes, but what about in the short term? What are the economic options that are available to the Sri Lankan government at this point in time that will be palatable, that will be politically acceptable to what is a very angry population at the moment?
Well, in order to subdue the anger, immediate response should be providing solutions to their basic needs. So this perhaps can be mitigated through credit lines, loans on a very short-term basis, but it is not a sustainable solution. So this is why Sri Lanka should not delay with IMF in order to gain international credibility. That would ensure bilateral and multilateral support in return. And I also think that Sri Lanka should rethink and take necessary measures on debt suspension in order to keep its diminishing USD. Definitely macroeconomic and microeconomic reforms should be made, and Sri Lanka should also look at adjusting electricity and fuel prices and look into tax reforms and restructure state-owned enterprises. These are all contributing to the dire economic state that the country is facing at the moment. So in the meantime, I think we also should improve our export and service industry.
Dr. Chulani, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Dr. Chulani Atanayake with the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. We're going to take a quick break. We will be back with more. Make sure you stay tuned.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan
kita boleh hentikan spekulasi adalah Melayu pun
bukan orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine, mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
I tak kacau hidup you, so you jangan kacau hidup I.
Bagi saya habis cakap dulu boleh?
What happened to us?
Cinta menguasai segalanya.
Itu taste Emma kan?
You are not my taste.
Abang pasti ke dia pilihan abang ni?
It's you and me.
Kau kena percaya dengan jodoh.
Cinta dengan drama lebih menarik.
Oh, I love you. I love you very, very much. Mostly.
What is that?
Cannot, Bo. I'm here for work.
Saya akan tolong awak cari Darwish.
Serius ah?
Serius?
That's like.
Ina Karina, mu kena batal macam ni muka dia kau.
Tak payahlah.
Macam mana? Dah jumpa dah weather.
Anja, kalau you tinggalkan I, you takkan senang sampai bila-bila.
Hai! Mana boleh peluk? Kan dosa je tu.
You jangan perasan bagi me 5 je.
Autumn in Wales. Sewa dan stream on demand atau sila ke saluran 480.
Yang telus dan tulus bersama yang paling dipercayai.
Suara Malaysia, segenap dimensi, bergema merentas platform.
Seimbang, terkini, laporan khas dan eksklusif.
Saksikan segmen Sinar Awani
Setiap hari 8 malam
di saluran 501 Astro Awani.
Hi, thanks so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our look at Sri Lanka's deepening economic crisis, the growing public discontent, as well as the spiraling political turmoil there. What are Sri Lanka's options now to stem the worsening crises? Let's speak to Dr. Tamilvendan Ananda Vinayagan. He is a teaching associate at University of Nottingham in UK. Dr. Tamil, can we begin our conversation today by perhaps looking at what has led to the crisis culminating to this point? We understand that this is Sri Lanka's problems throughout years of mismanagement, but specifically, could you look into why Sri Lanka has failed to deal with the sovereign debt problem over the years?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, Shara and Melissa. I mean, there are a range of issues, and I think the previous speaker has mentioned a couple of those issues already. I think the post-colonial elite of Sri Lanka has lived on borrowed money for too long and have alienated themselves really from the people in this country. But aggravating the crisis, Sri Lanka was the first global south country that has really opened up to neoliberal trade from in the late 1965 onwards, moving on to a standard of international trade that has attracted international investment in the country, but at the same time has created a disbalance in the economy. But the current crises that we are seeing is really aggravated by different factors then. It's not only the sovereign, the debt that was accumulated over the last decades. It was then moreover in face of the end of the war with an overburdening of debt taken on from China and India, and now again Sri Lankan the Sri Lankan government is turning to China and Sri Lanka. But then also in this mix, we saw the decline of tourism in the country in face of the pandemic, an ill-timed tax cut in 2019 as some kind of a gesture towards the people, and then the ban on fertilizers that has then contributed to lower crop outcome in the country. This comes intertwined with the 2016 and 2017 monsoon that has also had its impact on harvesting in the country. So all of that is a toxic mix to which Sri Lanka has come to, with declining commodity prices, where rubber and tea cannot be exported as it was supposed to be. And it is a mix of everything, but largely I would blame it on the current Sri Lankan government, which is very much living from borrowed money and has intoxicated its people, and then eliminating and alienating itself from the people.
Yeah, so Tamal, if you could help us understand, I mean, the Rajapaksa family and, Mahinda Rajapaksa and the current president came back to power after a hiatus, with a very strong mandate. And clearly, there were large segments of Sri Lankan society who believed that they could lead the country, onwards. What's gone wrong? I mean, what exactly are their ideological blinkers or their worldview? What's stopping them from seeing the problem for what it is and addressing it?
It's a very good point, Sharat. I mean, the Rajapaksa government, like many other political families in the country, have established their name. We have seen this with the Bandaranaike family. We have seen this with the Jayawardena family. And now we have, obviously, the Rajapaksa family. And the Rajapaksas had this sort of a fame in the country because they were able to defeat the LTTE in the country, and they were running on this euphoria after the end of 2009 until 2015. But eventually the people voted Mahinda Rajapaksa, the current prime minister, out of power because not of international pressure regarding war and accountability before the United Nations due to the war crimes committed in the country, but rather because of the economy. The interest was economy for the people. So it all circles back to the issue of the point of what Bill Clinton once formulated, another neoliberal, but as he formulated, it's the economy stupid. People voted him out. But then he came back because the people were looking for a strongman to come back into power. So Gotabaya Rajapaksa came back into power in the hope that he would re-foster and re-envision Sri Lanka. And he played into the hands of the Sinhalese elite, and in particular the Sinhalese people who are very nationalistic in this regard. And the Rajapaksa government knew how to play the nationalist antagonisms in the country to come back into power. Their promise when they came into power was to revive the political institutions through a strong leadership, but moreover to revive the economy. But as we have seen with the tax cuts and also the fertilizer ban, that approach to economy has completely went wrong. The governor of the central bank has stepped down. We don't have a finance minister. He has resigned after 24 hours. So the country is in turmoil.
Definitely. And I'm just wondering, the decision of the government to kind of stave off economic collapse by going to China and India, but refusing to go to the IMF, was that the right move?
Well, what is the choice really for this country? This country has had three different colonizers, with the Portuguese, Dutch, and the British. And in post-colonial time, it was just only replaced by a neo-colonial elite in the country. And now it has turned to new imperial powers like India and China. And at the same time, we should also not forget that the IMF is a neoliberal and neo-colonial institution that propounds a Western ideology of neoliberalism in the country. We can argue and debate if it was the right move to look first at India and China for too long, and as a matter of fact, they still do. But now Sri Lanka has surrendered itself, like Argentina did, and in a similar case with a third world elite over there as well, to these international financial institutions after having accumulated such massive debt. And I think the project of neoliberalism that has caused this whole situation is failed. And Sri Lanka, like many other global south countries, are the very best example for this failure of neoliberalism.
But Tamil, look, let's put it this way. I mean, from, we put aside the political elite and we look at the population. They have aspirations, they have desires, they have a sense of what they want. What kind of hard realities will they have to face? And are they willing to accept the bitter medicine that often comes with having, deep structural adjustments that, I mean, not to use that neoliberal term, but to restructure the society in the economy in a sustainable fashion?
It's also a good question, Sharat. I think everything what comes along with structural adjustment programs now along the way are the harbingers of neoliberalism in the country. We are going to see an onslaught on economic and social rights, and we are going to see that people who are already impoverished are going to be further alienated, in particular the minorities. What we know from the neoliberal opening of the country in the 1960s, 1970s is there was the government, the elite government has played one minority against the majority and moreover have decreased the value of trade unions. So the people are not really with a voice. And I think at the end of the day, the Sinhalese population as a majority population, as well as the Tamil and Muslim population and all the other minorities who are in the country are going to face very severe times coming ahead the line, because we already have to pay 4 billion. We have to service 4 billion US dollars this year with a crushing debt of 70 billion and with a declining foreign exchange reserve that we have of 2 billion. So at the end of the day, it's not the elite that has to pay the bill, it's going to be the people. And all the international measures that will come along the way will have an immediate impact on the people, because the people's economies, their livelihoods will be the collateral damage of structural adjustment programs of the international financial institutions. But it's also, when we look at India and China, the sell-off of land. I heard earlier of Hambantota. We are going to see a further encroachment on Sri Lanka as some kind of a vessel for geopolitical consideration of China and India on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're going to see international financial institutions using the people's livelihoods as their collateral when they want their money back.
Tamil, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Dr. Tamil Vendan Ananda Vinayagan there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.